Good morning, everyone. This is Doug. This is going to be a continuation of the series about was Paul a Roman agent? And this episode is about a man named Epaphroditus. He was a freedman of Nero. He was Nero's personal aide. And the title of this episode is, Did Paul have close ties with Nero's personal aide, this gentleman? Did Paul have these ties going to pre-Christian days? So could Paul have actually known and had a personal friendship with Nero himself and through his aide Epaphroditus? Let's take a look at that. Now, I want to tell you why I looked in this direction. I had not heard of this before until one of the people on that panel I was recently participating in on History Valley. I was given this article by C.H. Lawson by Jacob Berman, and so I read it. And in there, he had a very interesting topic. And I'm just going to read this to you, and then you'll realize why I was interested. So the title of the whole article, what is if the historical Jesus was the heir to the throne? A reconstruction based on the first century Dead Sea Scrolls. Okay, so it didn't give me a clue, really, from the title that I was going to find something like this. So he's talking about Josephus and Paul. Both were friends with Epaphroditus. Epaphroditus was the personal secretary for Emperor Nero. He was later the personal secretary for Emperor Domitian and the publisher of Josephus's writings. So this man published Josephus's writings. Paul bragged of his personal friendship with Epaphroditus. Paul's original name was Saul. That's in Acts 13:9. Josephus mentions a, quote, Saulus, a relative of Agrippa. Okay, so Herod Agrippa is a relative of who else? That would be Antipas, Herod Antipas. That would be his brother. And remember who Paul, according to Acts 13:1, Luke even says it. Menahem was a boyhood friend of Herod the Tetrarch, Herod Antipas, and Saul. So he would also have been connected with Agrippa. And Josephus just observes that Saulus, which is another name for Paul, his Jewish name would be Shaul, but it would be used by Romans in a different way, so they would have a Roman Latin-sounding name, Saulus. Josephus mentions a Saulus, a relative of Agrippa, who taught Queen Helen of Edessa. And he puts in there, also known as Antioch, that circumcision was not necessary. So Saulus was communicating to Queen Helen of Edessa that she shouldn't require a husband who was circumcised. It's not necessary. This is Antiquities of the Jews, book 20, chapter 43 to 46, or subparagraphs 43 to 46. And this is discussed in Eisenman, and this is discussed in Philippians 3:2, or the mention of this, and who went to Achaia, also known as Corinth, to report to Emperor Nero. So Saulus went to Achaia to report to Emperor Nero. So Nero had come to Achaia. See how all this is starting to link up? And this person, Saulus, already has known Emperor Nero way before he became a Christian. If this is all putting the pieces in the puzzle together. It is known that Paul was opposed to circumcision, Galatians 6, verse 12, and had been to both Antioch and Corinth. Paul admitted that he knew the so-called saints in Nero's house. So when he's under arrest, he's socializing with the Nero's house, and he says Nero's house sends greetings to the Philippians when he writes them. So Paul admitted that he knew the saints in Nero's house, and aristocrats like Epaphroditus. This is in Philippians 2:25, 4:18, and then he mentions Acts 22. Then he mentions Acts 25, verses 21 to 25, and he mentions Romans 13:16, who was the private secretary for both emperors Nero and Domitian. So after Nero persecuted Christians, and then later he committed suicide, Domitian then became the next person to whom Epaphroditus became the personal assistant. Paul's friend Epaphroditus was also the original publisher for Josephus's writings. That's pretty remarkable. And I think I mentioned recently that Paul's writings are astoundingly good. I mean, perfect sophistry. That's elegantly done. He knows so many poets and philosophers, and if you know all those poets and philosophers, you recognize he's just borrowing sayings. That's why he sounds so eloquent. But he's borrowing it over and over again, and they're always good. You can reuse Jesus' words, for example, and you're eloquent because those words were very well put. And Paul, though, is using the resources of pagan philosophers to do this. And that's what is amazing is Josephus is a very educated man as well. So Paul is in an interesting circle of people. Let's just put it that way. And that includes Nero right here. All right, so now let's see if I can find some of the evidence that corroborates this independently from his statements. Let's take a look. Now let's begin first of all with Paul's reference to Epaphroditus. Now Epaphroditus is mentioned in Philippians 2 verse 25 and 4 verse 18. Let's look at 2:25. In the meantime, I think it necessary to send to you Epaphroditus, my brother, fellow worker, and fellow soldier, as well as your messenger and letorgos. What is that? It's the word for public servant. See, the first part means people, and the second part means worker, worker for the people, to my need. So let's get a little biography of this gentleman. And you'll find there's two Wikipedia articles. One does not mention any connection between Epaphroditus and the freedman of Nero, Epaphroditus. However, that's, I believe, incorrect. It should have been in both articles so people could see this name has been associated with a person who's very important in history. Now let's listen to this. Yes, Tiberius Claudius Epaphroditus was the personal secretary to Roman Emperor Nero, and he therefore was a public servant. He would have been a liturgos. His life. He was born around 20 to 25 AD. Epaphroditus was a freedman and a favorite of Nero. He was a master of Greek. I wonder if that could have helped Paul in some of his writings. And received military honors for helping Nero unmask the Pisonian conspiracy. Death. Epaphroditus was executed by Domitian after failing to prevent Nero's suicide. Domitian banished Epaphroditus before ordering his execution. So he only had a short-term job as Domitian's secretary, to put it lightly. Interesting if you're curious about people like Epictetus, famous moral and Stoic philosopher. Epaphroditus was the master of the philosopher Epictetus. Epictetus may have witnessed the aftermath of Nero's death and heard about it from Epaphroditus and other members of Nero's household. Okay, so this is a person of great influence, and as I've shown you previously, there was a reason to believe Paul had some connection to him here before his time as a Christian, or even after the time he was a Christian. It's not clear, is it? So anyway, let's continue. So the book of the letter to the Philippians is a prison epistle. It's while he's in the prison there. But this prison imprisonment seems to be very loose, where he can be walking around Caesar's household because he's going to say something interesting. He's going to send a greeting from Caesar's household, which would have to include Liturgus. So let's take a look at that. Philippians 4:22. All the saints greet you, especially those of Caesar's household. Okay, so he's clearly in the location of Caesar's household or vicinity of them, and has been in there and met them, and who else but Epaphroditus is who's talking about, is sending his greetings to those at Philippi. And incidentally, this settles any question of where was Paul when he wrote the Epistle of the Philippians. Some people try to argue he wasn't necessarily at Rome. That doesn't make any sense. All saints greet you, especially those of Caesar's household, which means he's with them, and he's just communicating from where he's sitting his greetings from that place, meaning where Caesar's household is, back towards the people of Philippi. So he is in Caesar's household, and that includes Epaphroditus, his personal secretary, Nero's personal secretary. I just want to also show you why people they feel the need to kind of prove that Paul was in Rome or not, and it's just beyond doubt because of that passage I just read you. But the other reason you know he's in Rome is this proof. He makes reference to the imperial guard in Philippians 1:13. The letter mentions the Praetorian, means the Praetorian Guard. This is the elite unit of 10,000 men who guard Caesar, and that's their job, to make him be protected from any assault. And that's where he's getting his personal protection from, Nero's own personal guard of 10,000 men. which is more likely to refer to the imperial guard than a governor's palace. The imperial guard was an elite group of soldiers that protected the emperor, and Rome had the largest concentration of them in the empire. And then the other argument was Caesar's household. His greetings from Caesar's household to the people at Philippi. But that's the conclusive proof. That's the kind of statement you would make when you're there with the Caesar's household. You say, I'm with them, and they're talking to me, and they want me to send you their regards. So that ends the story. He's in Rome, and he's writing the epistle to the Philippians, and he's mentioning the Praetorian Guard, he's taking good care of me, and he mentions Epaphroditus, and he's the personal aide of Nero, and apparently everybody would know that. This is not going past these people in Philippi. They know who he's talking about in Caesar's household, who is sending these greetings, because Paul has mentioned him twice in Philippians at 2:25 and 4:18. All right, now I want to step back and go back to the beginning slide. Epaphroditus, freedman of Nero, Nero's personal aide. And the question I raised was, did Paul's extraordinary prior military aid come direct from Nero himself? In other words, what Mr. Lawson said is it appears there are facts that Paul even knew of Epaphroditus long before this trip to Rome. And I think the evidence here is very clear. Let me show you that. When he gets arrested in Acts 21 because of his friend Trophimus violating the middle wall separation of the temple in an uncircumcised state, he goes in there, and the Jews of Asia get upset. They scream and yell and want Paul's throat, claiming you brought him in here. But Luke says they base that solely on the fact they saw Trophimus with Paul prior to this time. Trophimus did come across from Ephesus with Paul on the trip, but he was not together when Paul was in his ceremonial bath doing his activities for the Nazarite vows. Paul was in one place, and Trophimus was in another place. So he wandered away from Paul. Maybe the Jews of Asia were accusing Paul that you should have stayed in control of him. You should have known he didn't know what to do. And again, just to remind you about that, the little details that are important there, Trophimus was from Ephesus, and believe it or not, credible enough as it may sound, in the epistle to the Ephesians, Paul wrote the Ephesians specifically that all the law and the ordinances have all been taken away, including the middle wall of separation at the temple. So he said to Trophimus, if you see it there, it's really in God's eyes gone. You can just walk in there in an uncircumcised state. Don't worry about it. Circumcision is nothing. So just go. And that caused a complete conflagration, though, when Trophimus went in there. And this is why the appeal, when he appealed to Caesar, it would seem in most worlds, wouldn't that be extremely risky? Once you appeal to the emperor, I should let you know, that changed the opportunity. You could be executed, even a Roman citizen could be killed once they appealed to Caesar. So that wasn't a smart move. As long as he stayed with the other people, he could have been just imprisoned, and he was apparently living a really fun life there in Caesarea. He was a very loose prisoner there. He could have been killed, because that's the rule. Once you appeal, you waive your right not to be killed as a Roman citizen if Nero wants to have you executed. But anyway, that's a whole nother thing. Now, my point here is listen to the facts of what happens in response. What kind of protection does Paul get? Is it in any way makes sense that he isn't like one of the most important people in the Roman Empire? So the commander, so let's see what it says here. Sent to Felix, and he called the two centurions. So this Roman commander was confronted with the fact Paul pulled out his certificate that he was a Roman citizen, and this obviously shocked this man. And then he realized who Paul was, and now look at the response. So he's going to protect him from the mob. Okay, so I was reading this always thinking, well, maybe since it sounds like a group of people very angry and they want to kill Paul, so they got to do some serious protection. But look at the level of protection. Just look at this. And he called and he called for two centurions, so that's guys who can control multiple units at a time, 100 men each. So you get 200 soldiers, you have to have two centurions, saying, prepare 200 soldiers, that's 100 for each centurion, 70 horsemen, and 200 spearmen. I mean, what's that for? To go to Caesarea. So they're going to take Paul from Jerusalem all the way to the coast of the Mediterranean Sea, where Caesarea is. at the third hour of the night, and provide mounts to set Paul on, and bring him safely to Felix the governor. So he is totally being guarded by the Romans, but at an extraordinary level that doesn't really make a lot of sense. 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, 200 spearmen. This is what Nero would get. This is like the main force of the Roman armies in Judea at the time to keep the peace. But then next, later, when he has to be taken to Rome, look at some of the things that are going on. He's being put on a ship with the most elite regiment, imperial regiment, the Augustan cohort. They're right below the Praetorian Guard. Praetorian Guard is the most elite of all, but then below them is the Augustan cohort, and that's mentioned in Acts 27:11. And when it was decided we would sail for Italy, they delivered Paul and some other prisoners to a centurion, a guy who can control 100 soldiers, named Julius, or of the Augustan cohort. So he has this elite unit to protect him on this ship. Can you believe this? This is extraordinary. And sometimes translated as the imperial regiment, and that's unfortunate. That's to Mounty's credit. It actually is saying it's the Augustan cohort, not simply the imperial regiment. All right. Then next, once the ship arrives in Rome or near Rome and he's brought to Rome, guess who's guarding him? The 10,000 unit men of the Praetorian Guard. Acts 28. According to Acts chapter 28, the centurion Julius gave custody of Paul to the chief of the soldiers, who was probably the commander of the Praetorian Guard. That's because his name was Clemens, which matches the actual historical name of the person at that time who was the head of the Praetorian Guard. Now, I want to also share with you an article called Paul and the Praetorian Guard, November 22, 2018, this paragraph. To be under guard by the Praetorians meant that Paul must have been considered an important prisoner, since these soldiers were the personal elite guards of the emperor himself. Augustus established the Praetorians, and Tiberius stationed them here in Rome at their own fortresses. So these are prior emperors. In the time of Claudius and Nero, the guard was expanded to about 10,000 soldiers. So now he's being guarded by 10,000 soldiers. He's literally being treated as the most elite of elites. And as we saw from his greeting from the household of Caesar, that he's living in the quarters of the household of Caesar. And he's being guarded in the same fashion you would guard Nero. So now let's turn back again about Epaphroditus. And Paul calls him my brother, fellow worker, fellow soldier, messenger, and public servant. Latorgos, to my need. So he's a public servant who is serving Paul's needs, and that's exactly who he was. He was a guy who was a public servant serving Rome by serving the Emperor Nero. And we've gone through this before. I just want to give you a little bit more proof that he's an important person. There's actually a funerary inscription to the same individual, Epaphroditus. So he has got his own plaque on a near the Roman Empire center of the power at Rome to recognize who he was. Now, here's a little biography. Epaphroditus was an imperial freedman and secretary, a libellus, which means that he drafted the Emperor Nero's replies to petitions. He is mentioned as apparitor Caesarum, which means that he was some sort of servant of the imperial family, but his specific duties are not mentioned. Now, I'm just going to say here, it is even possible he's the guy who's going to draft the ruling on the case for Nero, right? That's not impossible. The appeal could be in the hands of this man as well. Also, Theophilus being the magistrate judge to whom these the book of Acts and the book of Luke are being both addressed to give information helpful to the appeal on the side of Paul. So now with what you've learned, let's listen again to what Mr. Lawson said and see if what he's saying sounds very reasonable. And if you disagree with him, then please let me know what evidence you have to dispute him. Both Paul and Josephus were friends with Epaphroditus. Epaphroditus was the personal secretary for Emperor Nero. That's been proven clearly. He was later personal secretary for Emperor Domitian. That we also know, but it didn't last forever. And the publisher, Epaphroditus was the publisher of Josephus's writings. That could be very significant to explain a lot of other things about why Paul's writings are so well done. Paul bragged of his personal friendship with Epaphroditus, mentioning him twice in the epistle to the Philippians. Paul's original name was Saul, Acts 13:9. Josephus, the guy who knows of Paul of the same. They have the same friend. Paul and Josephus have the same friend, Epaphroditus. Josephus mentions a Saulus, because that's how Josephus, being a Jewish person, he would probably want to refer to him not by his Latin name, which is Paulus. He would refer to him by Josephus, Saulus, and mentioned he's a relative of Agrippa. Well, how would he know that? Well, we showed you Acts 13:1. Paul is the childhood friend of Manaen and Herod the Tetrarch, meaning the brother of Herod Agrippa, who taught Queen Helen of Edessa that circumcision was not necessary. Antiquities 20, verse 43 to 46. The doctrines of Paul, right? And Eisenman brings this up, and Philippians 3:2 references this, and who went to Achaia, also known as Corinth, to report to Emperor Nero. So this Saulus had met Emperor Nero once before, early in the life, I would say probably prior to the time Paul was even a Christian. He had met Nero in this meeting. It is known that Paul was opposed to circumcision, Galatians 6:12, and had been to both Antioch and Corinth. Paul admitted that he knew so-called saints in Nero's house. So we have that reference where he says the greetings from Nero's house, Caesar's house, are being offered. Paul says in Philippians to the people of Philippi, excuse me. And aristocrats like Epaphroditus, Philippians 2:25 and so on, who was a private secretary for both emperors, Nero and Domitian. Paul's friend, Epaphroditus, was also the original publisher for Josephus's works. So Paul is at the center of power. He's at the center of power of the Roman Empire, and he's being treated with a royal treatment that is unknown to any other individual. And he's tight with Epaphroditus, who is the author, not the author, he's the publisher of Josephus's works. How interesting. And Saulus actually comes off pretty good inside it has a lot of attention, let's put it that way. So if Saulus is Paul, and it seems that's who he is, then Epaphroditus knows who Josephus is writing about is Paul. The person you and I know is Paul. Epaphroditus knows as Saulus. So this is another reason why Epaphroditus would be so tight with him. He had a history with the Roman people prior to allegedly becoming a Christian. So that's why this is not insignificant that Paul mentions Epaphroditus twice in his epistle to the Philippians. And now we can put all the pieces together thanks to Mr. Lawson. And so therefore you can make even more clear that Paul's connection wasn't just with Herod Agrippa or Herod the Tetrarch, Herod Antipas. No, his connections went all the way to the interior of Caesar's household into Epaphroditus. And he had already met him in a previous time and also met Nero. And that's why Josephus pays a lot of attention to this character called Saulus. So now, when we get to the time when we're going to talk about Saulus and Josephus, which we will get to later, then pay close attention. Why is Epaphroditus making his friend Saulus the object of Josephus's attention? Quite a lot of attention. And we'll see how that went too. So Paul's relationship with Epaphroditus has a lot of interesting conclusions that derive from it. All right, God bless. I hope that helps everybody. Ciao. Bye.